Welcome everybody. Rev back here with chapter 6 of Patrick Hoban's book, Road of the King. Um, this is deck building, the chapter on deck building. So I think there's a lot of good stuff in here. It is very, very long. So as I was writing down my notes for this video, um, I was trying to keep these videos like between 10 and 15 minutes max. This one might run a little bit long just because it's over 100 pages, I think. So yeah, um, we'll get through it, and I'm gonna have to, I guess, just read more or less some of like his headers, um, and take it from there, as well as throw in some of my own thoughts. Um, if you aren't subscribed, supporting the channel is always helpful. So let's jump in. All right, so the first thing he talks about are some like general deck building philosophies and things you want to do that I think are quite obvious, like maximize utility. Having a card that does, um, you know, one thing as opposed to, multiple things. You're going to want the thing that does multiple things typically. Lower cost is better. So, why would you play a card that requires a discard when there's a version of the card that doesn't require a discard, for example? And then non-linear being better. Um, Meaning like when you're building your deck, you kind of just want to have more plays available as opposed to like just one win con. Like the prime example for this, in my opinion, for GOAT format would be like Steingate, like most builds of Steingate, which is like you just use Stein and that's your only win condition, versus like Reasoning Gate where you have like multiple lines to win typically. Um, Says don't follow the crowd, think independently, and that's a huge, huge advantage when you're playing current because the meta is always going to be, I won't say always, but usually going to be considerably more fresh. Um, Whereas like with GOAT format, in my opinion, it's more or less solved. Like there is a best deck, and even within that best deck, it's probably solved down to like 37 cards. And then like probably 10 to 11 of the side deck cards are solved as well. So um, it's just, Chaos Turbo is very, very prevalent. So I don't think you can really deviate from the crowd that much without being at a very distinct advantage, or disadvantage rather. Then he goes into card categories, um, and yeah, this is long. So let me find the place in the chapter. Um, and here I think he gets again a little bit too nitty gritty, and I don't know how transferable a lot of this is to other formats, but he says there are like starter cards, superior extenders, additional extenders, cards that re-raise your ceiling, reactive extenders, floodgates, responsive defense, bombs, spot removal, core removal, chainable defense, engine requirements, and then placeholders. Um, I'm not going to get into the specifics of each of these cards, and he goes into like what specific ratios you would want in a deck, and he even like plotted out like all of his other different decks, and there's like definitely some clear trends. Like you obviously want like a pretty high amount of starter cards. Like you're not going to run just like two starters in a deck. Um, and like he averages around like 10 to 12, it looks like, sometimes 13. Um, and then like there's usually a higher amount of extenders too, like around 7 it looks like, and then a handful of bombs. So like again, I don't think there's really much use in going through all of this just because he mentions like there should be clear trends on like how much or how little you should have of these different classifications in any given deck, like irrespective of the meta. But I don't think that's true for a few reasons. First is he only had success like in a very, I won't say small, but like he had success like pretty in one period of Yu-Gi-Oh, and Yu-Gi-Oh definitely changes based on when you're playing. So I don't think these rules are transferable like from like 2005 formats all the way to like current. And also like I feel like you could trick yourself like when there are this many categorizations, you could be like, oh, this could be a starter, or like, oh, I guess I could consider this like a reactive extender, and like you could kind of like bucket it where you think it will be and like create your own narrative. So I don't think it's particularly helpful. I mean, other than like very rough rules of thumb. It's just like you're not going to create a deck full of bombs with no starters and vice versa. So, um, all right, what was next? He goes into the like different ratios that he uses, and like you should not have this much of this card, yada yada yada. Sorry, losing my place here a little bit. Okay, I'm back. So he goes into um, the uh, what he calls good and bad filters, and I'll just read these filters like of what he calls deck building rules in this next portion. I'm going to be just doing a lot of reading of titles and add my thoughts if there's anything that I think needs explaining. So here's some good filters. He says, being a spell is positive. I agree. Cards that enable special summons are good. I agree. Searching cards is a better mechanic than drawing cards. I 100% agree. Drawing cards is good. Agree. Adding from hand is better. Adding from deck to hand is better than adding from hand from anywhere else. I agree, because you have to set up a grave if you want to add from grave. Um, Special summoning from deck is better than special summoning from anywhere else. 100% agree. Special summoning from grave is good, but it's worse than special summoning from deck. Absolutely agree. Cards that special summon themselves from hand are good, but worse than special summoning from deck or grave. I agree with that. Cards that serve multiple functions are good. That's a fact. Cards that gain value immediately are good. Fact. Grave effects are good. Fact. I guess that doesn't seem to fit with the other ones because it's not comparing it to anything else. It's just a statement. Cards that get effects after being detached from an XYZ are good. I don't do XYZs. Cards that replace themselves are good. Generally true. Pendulum monsters are better than non-pendulum monsters. I quit around that time because pendulums were broken, so it's probably true. Cards that can be activated regardless of what our opponent does are good. That is true. Cards that are useful when going first are good. I made a video on this. It's true and not true. Cards that generate more cards are good, of course. Effects that trigger when destroyed by either player are good. Yep. Floodgates are the most powerful defensive cards. Not sure about that. Uh, Chainable defense is preferred to responsive defense. Um, that is, I think, generally almost always true. Like if you just think about like Chaos Turbo, chainable defense like Regeki Break is really the glue that holds that whole deck together. It's very flexible. He says bad filters. Being a normal summon is a detractor. I guess that's true. Having to tribute summon is a negative. Generally true. Being a trap is a detractor. Traps are worse than the green cards. Yep. Cards that involve the opponent in some way are less optimal. Absolutely. Effects that trigger when destroyed by battle or the opponent's card are subpar. 100%. Cards that get effects when they inflict battle damage are subpar. That is true because you have to take risk to attack. Cards that modify attack and defense are subpar. Generally true. Cards that activate in the end phase are subpar because you don't get the effect immediately. And he goes into like what some of the exceptions are to these rules, just because there are always going to be exceptions. So yeah, like I think what was the card that he mentioned? Like super rejuvenation, like with the end phase one, like that card activates in the end phase, but is like beyond broken in a lot of formats. So uh, not steadfast rules. Then he goes into math for like drawing certain cards and variants and probability distributions and stuff that is not well suited for me to cover in an audio format. Um, so yeah, uh, it's just more or less kind of like understanding like some very 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 basic statistical things, which I think like if you've been playing you probably just intuitively know anyway. Then he goes into the power versus consistency curve with certain cards and um, like the fact that cards are typically designed to be either consistency cards or power cards, and there are usually going to be trade-offs for that. And you don't want to just run power cards or just run consistency cards, and the mix of that is going to be in some way optimal. Just because, like in a perfect world, you'd have a hyper consistent card that's also hyper powerful, but those cards usually get banned. All right, next is some other rules, which I will just read and add short commentary to for deck building rules. it starts here. So it says, it is better to out opposing threats with our engine than with defensive cards. And I didn't get this one until I kind of read what he was saying, but like you'd rather have in-engine removal rather than having to add separate removal, which isn't integrated with your deck, which I think is true. Um, Deck building rule, it's better to gain a card than it is to have an opponent lose a card. Um, I think that very, very much so depends. And it depends on whether or not you're ahead or behind. So, yeah. As well as what like the relative card count is. Like I think if it's a very, very simplified game state versus like a locked game state where players have like 10 cards each, I think that it very much so depends. It is better to focus on raising our ceiling than it is to focus on lowering our opponent's ceiling. I'd say, I'd also say that depends. I think maybe at like the deck level, that is true, just because most of the best decks that I've seen are really just the more sacky decks. Like if you're trying to win a tournament, that just really focus on their own ceiling. Like you very rarely see like pure anti-meta decks winning anything, so that's pretty true. Power matters slightly more than consistency. Um, Again, I think this is a function of like variance. Like by its nature, the sackier, more powerful decks and cards should be the ones winning the tournament, even if they have a lower average win rate. Or I guess the frequency of their win rate is different. Skip over some of these. Combo cards are more powerful than standalone cards. I don't know if you can make that conclusion. Um, it goes into like win more cards, which are cards that like really only work when you're winning. Those don't get emotionally attached to cards. Cards should be focused on your win condition. Auto wins are necessary for winning tournaments, which I have had to learn the hard way. You kind of just want those sacky bullshit cards like Return from the Different Dimension in your deck. Deck build to go first. I made a video on that, and I think it may be wrong, his take. Um, all right. And here, like some of his explanations are like 4 pages long, which is insane. This one's like 6 pages. Um, he says getting lucky adds to the power level by detracting from consistency. Deck build so that you have the chance to get lucky. That is a very, very important lesson. You have to give yourself the chance to sack. So yeah, this deck or this game is very, very random. There's a lot of variance, so you have to let that variance work in your favor at times. Milling increases the number of chances we have to get lucky. Hello, Vayu Turbo. Our strategy should be able to coherently function when variance does not work in our favor. And I think that's true. Like even decks that have a very high ability to get lucky, like you want them to have a strong enough baseline of power and consistency to not just totally fall apart, or else everyone would just play Exodia, and like that's the highest ceiling, like most luck rewarding deck in the format, but it's just so shit that it doesn't make sense to play it. So there's a balance with that. High risk, high reward ratios increase variance. Um, yeah, so he just goes into like whether or not like running 1 or 3 of a card or like somewhere in between, like in parts of your engine can increase or decrease variance. I thought was a neat point. Um, he makes the same point later. Um, then this is something that he hits on multiple times, which I've already said, which is that cards that allow for a play to have open-ended options make the deck less linear and increase consistency. I think that's obvious. You don't want your deck to be made of cards that just do one thing. Um, Avoid having duplicates of cards that fulfill the same role if they can be accessed by an open-ended card. So again, like you'd rather run a Regeki Break in Chaos Turbo than Sakuretsu or something. Or you wouldn't want like additional Sakuretsus if you could probably just add a Regeki Break because it's more flexible. And they serve sometimes the same purpose, but Regeki Break can do like 10 other things better. All right, a lot of these rules are kind of things that he said before. Um, yeah. Here, the extra deck is a toolbox of card rules. This does make sense for Edison. Building your extra deck properly is very important, despite being largely solved. All right, I think we're coming to the close here. The last section was side decking, and side decking, I think, in practice is one of the hardest things in the game to do. I'm skipping over some of the rules he has, but it's pretty basic what he covers, which is like counter side decking, like making their cards dead, avoiding oversiding, which is super important. Like maintenance of your engine, like you don't want to be siding out engine cards typically unless you really have to. Um, you don't want to, like on the topic of oversiding, like side in like 12 cards for a specific matchup just because then your deck is just basically being built to lose by less. Like you're not going to be able to actually do anything. You're just going to like be stopping what your opponent does. You want to optimize for going first and second. You want to see if you can agree to side cards out when it's in your favor. And that's it. I think I was able to get through that relatively quickly. Um, again, this is a very long chapter, so if you've read the book and it seems like there's like, I don't know, 40% of the meat and potatoes missing, it's because it is. Um, there's a lot of detail in a lot of those deck building rules and what his thoughts are on it. The vast majority of which I think are really good takeaways and I agree with. Some of it I'm not so sure about, or I'm not so sure it's super transferable to um, Edison and Goat or legacy formats. I think it's more of like a modern type thing. So, damn, I was talking a lot. My throat's getting dry. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you in the next one.